So that was cool, right? Amazon serverless computing. I'll tell you what else is cool. Things like Ninja sloths are cool, right? So I also have stickers, and this is the Azure Ninja sloth mascot, right? And so if you feel like getting a sticker, approach me afterwards, and I'll do that. So, I mean, I spent 12 years working for Sun Microsystems and did a lot of talking about Java. So I've always thought I would stand here and talk at JavaForum, but I didn't quite believe it was going to be Microsoft. Especially not considering what happened while I was at Sun, in the relationship between Microsoft and the Java world, and Sun Microsystems, who at that point owned the Java stuff. So a little about Microsoft Gothenburg before I start. So we're about 40 people. 4 of us are cloud solution architects. A year ago, there were no cloud solution architects at the Gothenburg office. So this is really a focus area for Microsoft to expand around, the whole cloud story and helping our customers to move to the cloud. And a lot of what was said in the previous presentation is true, obviously, for Azure and as well, right? And as Amazon has its Lambda functions in Azure, we have our Azure Functions, right? So you can do exactly the same architecture and as you can on Amazon. But that's not what I was going to talk about today. Today, we're going to talk a little about Java, open source, and Microsoft. A short history of that. I'm going to explain a couple of the ways you can run Java on Azure, if you feel like it. I'm going to talk a little about SDKs and tooling. And finally, I'm going to sort of do a short demo of how to run some Java on Azure. And hopefully the demo gods are with me and everything will work as planned. But we'll see. Rika was talking about this, the sort of Microsoft loves Java stuff, right? And I was actually originally planning to have this sort of .NET T-shirt on, which when I was going to present to you, and then halfway through the presentation I was going to rip it off and have my sort of Microsoft loves Java T-shirt instead. But I couldn't find it, so you'll have to make do with me not taking my clothes off during this presentation. And a lot of the stuff that Microsoft does today is very, very different from what the company did, say, 4 years ago. The strategy has changed, the attitudes to things have changed, and we can say things like that Microsoft is now an open platform. It's not about .NET and Windows, and we have a really open infrastructure where you can run whatever workload on that you feel like. Because we want to live in this community, in this heterogeneous world. However, the relationship between Microsoft and the Java world didn't start off all that well. Right? I remember this, I was at Sun at the time, and we sued Microsoft for $1 billion, which is a good sort of round number. This was in 2002. And it had a lot to do with what Microsoft was doing in Windows with Java at the time. So, and the reasons outlined by us at Sun were that they were fragmenting the Java platform. They were flooding the market with incompatible Java runtimes. Terrible things. Forcing other companies to distribute or use products that are incompatible with Java. Significantly limiting Sun's distribution channels, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it was a lot about Microsoft making changes to the Java, programming language that sort of broke the main philosophy behind Java, which was write once, run everywhere. It took 3 years, and 150 lawyers, and eventually we ended up with, Microsoft paying $20 million. I mean, not really the 1 billion we started off with, but 20 million, and the settlement was that Microsoft was not allowed to use the Java logotype or the Java compatible logo on its products that included Java. Microsoft could continue to use the products, but new products had to be built along the Java spec, and so on. And this wasn't the only sort of, if you were around at that time, there were a lot of legal conflicts between Microsoft and the rest of the sort of world. We've also had a reasonably rocky history at Microsoft when it comes to open source and Linux. Steve Ballmer, who was this sort of very modest guy, not very outspoken, decided to say at a press conference that Linux was a cancer, and he didn't like the hippie GPL rubbish, right? And at that time, it was really difficult, I would say, for Microsoft, who were really interested in building their own stack, promoting Windows and all that, to understand what open source was about and what Linux was about. And this problem sort of, you could see it in lots of different ways. Amongst those, this Ballmer quote, which is rather nice, I think. So historically, you can say there's been like two completely different ecosystems. And if you were living in the Microsoft ecosystem, you would live on this side, and you would have all these nice things like .NET and Silverlight and SharePoint, which everyone loves, and Office, and you were sort of encouraged to sort of live in this box and, don't look over the fence because there's nothing there to see, right? But at the same time, this other stack was developing, right? So there was all the Linux-based stuff, the PHPs, the LAMP stacks, and the Javas of the world. And there was very little sort of communication between these two. You were either one or the other, and you could get into quite heated discussions about which side you were in, which is really, basically silly, right? It's like saying which is best, the fork or the knife, or that sort of thing. This is just tools to accomplish something. Sort of behind the scenes, without sort of telling a lot of people about it, Microsoft have actually been doing quite a lot in the open source community. So from 2005, when Bill Gates sent something called the Interop memo, where he informed all employees of Microsoft that there are other operating systems than Windows. You might not have noticed this, but there are others. And in some time in the future, we might have to do something with them, right? Or interact with them somehow. Through to, seeing technologies in the open source world that were useful on Windows. So, and engaging in those circumstances where, it sort of pushed the Windows ecosystem forward. So things like Samba and, PHP and stuff like that, and Apache, which you could see. Hadoop, it started picking up a bit with virtualization platform Hyper-V. Then suddenly the realization came that you might want to run other operating systems on sort of the Hyper-V platform. So that's when Linux kernel work started. And all through sort of Node.js and the launch of something called Microsoft Open Tech, there's been a lot of work, but it's sort of almost been behind the scenes. It's not something the company has sort of widely promoted. And that was the sort of state until 2014. Right? In 2014, suddenly the floodgates opened, Microsoft's strategy changed. We started open sourcing lots of stuff and using completely new technologies. And I mean, this was more or less down to one man. So Satya Nadella was appointed CEO for February, and you could hardly ask for a bigger contrast between Satya and Steve Ballmer, right? Two very different people. Satya is a big believer in collaborative community building, and he's really like. There have been some key points in Microsoft's history where the company has really pivoted. So some of you might remember that Microsoft didn't really believe in internet and TCP/IP. There were some other interesting things that Microsoft pushed, that will never work. But eventually, Microsoft came around, and when Microsoft pivots, it does it quite well, right? As in that case. And I think we've done it quite well as it comes to the open source world. So, for instance, we joined the Eclipse Foundation on the 8th of March 2016. And if you've been following Microsoft's, I'd say, the last year or so, you'll seen of lots of announcements and sort of media reports like this, right? Bash on Windows, the world is ending. Even more dramatic things have been sort of suggested that, and I mean, you can now actually run Bash on your Windows machine, which I do all the time because I'm not very good at PowerShell. And there's actually a complete, sort of almost complete Linux stack inside Windows 10. Other things, Microsoft joins Linux Foundation. In November last year, we decided that we need to be part of Linux Foundation. People were slightly surprised about that. In, I think this was October, it turned out that we were actually the biggest contributor on GitHub. So company-wise, Microsoft was the largest contributor to the open source community within GitHub. There are now 10,000 Microsoft engineers working on GitHub or have registered accounts on GitHub and that contribute to. So the whole way Microsoft develops things has changed. We used to sit inside sort of this little room and we sort of worked on things until we thought they were ready, and then we opened the doors and let them out. Now a lot of Microsoft products are actually developed in sort of the public space in GitHub for anyone to download, and we've run into a bit of the Google disease of things being in preview all the time and beta and you never quite know when they reach GA. But at the same time, there's a lot more opportunities to interact with Microsoft and Microsoft engineering than there ever have been. As an old Unix guy myself, I'd sort of love this. Microsoft has created a free BSD version. That's great. You can now run Unix on Azure. SQL Server is coming to Linux. Right? So there's already public previews out there. You can run if you're not happy with Oracle or feel you want to run something else than Postgres. Then you can actually run SQL Server, SQL Server, and it's as fully featured as the Windows version. We were at LinuxCon, and Linus Torvalds came up and had a coffee in Microsoft's booth, and our guys there at LinuxCon were very happy with this. So they even had this sort of inflatable penguin. They probably should have put some more air into it. I think it's a bit. It looks like Microsoft is sort of propping up the penguin somehow. And I mean, a couple of years ago, Linus said that Microsoft was basically the worst company you could find on the planet Earth. So things have changed over at Microsoft. Satya presents often that he loves Linux. As I said, we run Linux inside Windows. People say things like pigs flying. Mark Rusonovich, our CTO, he presents on Macs. It's not the old Microsoft that you might have known. And you can even run PowerShell on Linux or Mac. I don't understand why you would want to, but some of the Windows guys think PowerShell are great, so you can do it now if you want to. And everywhere within the company, we're talking open source, we're talking Linux, we're talking Java, we're talking, you know, technologies that we wouldn't have touched a couple of years ago with a barge pole even. So why do we do this? I mean, the world has changed, right? It's no longer, you no longer sit with your sort of laptop and you just run Windows or you just develop in you know, .NET or, you know, the world has changed. Ecosystems emerging. A surprising amount of people, when I went to talk to some of the N-Forum guys, a surprising amount of those people had actually also done Java. I'm sure some of you might even have done, you know, programmed something in .NET or .NET Core. So we're sort of breaking up these silos. And of course, you know, the cloud is helping. Being the cloud being this fantastic platform for all sorts of technologies. We see lots of innovation in the Linux open source space. There's really no reason why Microsoft shouldn't embrace this and, you know, build products based on it and use, you know, the whole open source methodology of developing software. And the bottom line is it expands our market. We can sell to people, you know, anywhere, using any tool, using any programming language. And it's a pragmatic business decision. But it did take someone like Satya to actually make that decision and say, this is it, right? We're going to have to do it. So, why would you want to run Java on Azure? Good question, right? We've already heard how fantastic you can run, you know, serverless on Amazon, right? I mean, one of the reasons would be that perhaps you want another option, right? Perhaps you're not happy with having one single cloud supplier. Perhaps you would like another one as a backup. And in that case, Azure is a good choice, right? So we have 38 Azure regions worldwide, presence almost everywhere. A region can be several data centers, sort of that can be connected together, but are usually geographically separated within the same country or unit. The expansion of Azure is actually phenomenal. So we sort of double the CPU count sort of every 12 to 15 months with Azure. So it's growing a lot. We've just, and those dots that are supposed to be red there in Korea coming soon actually opened yesterday. So the Korean data centers opened yesterday. And it's just, you know, the worldwide reach of Azure that's fantastic. And we anticipate, you know, having, you know, almost an Azure data center in every single country. And in some respects, it's necessary, you know, for information protection and that sort of thing, and all the sort of nasty legal stuff. You sometimes have to have that. And so, and you know, a lot of effort in Microsoft goes to expanding the reach of Azure. And actually, you know, curious fact now, you know, anyone at Microsoft who gets measured on a sales number, even if they're just selling something like, you know, on-premise Windows, today has some sort of Azure quota. Because Satya has said that this is Microsoft's bet, right? The cloud. This is what we're focusing on at the moment. Of course, to build out regions, you also have to build a lot of interconnect fiber. And this is just the sort of private interconnect fiber between the Azure data centers. And it's, someone told me today, it's not 1.6 any longer, it's 1.7 million miles of fiber. We're also building some really high-profile undersea cable projects, like the highest capacity ever between the US and Europe, which we're building together with Facebook. So one of the key things for, you know, a cloud, worldwide cloud, is to have enough network connectivity between the instances, but also to the customers, right? Because you're only as good as your last mile interconnect. And the Volvo wireless car man was talking about CDN locations. We have CDNs everywhere as well. So we have in Sweden, for instance, we have a CDN So you can get fast access from sort of almost every location in the world. Right. Originally, Azure was envisaged as being a PaaS service. So it was going to be somewhere where you just deployed applications on. But during the process of building out Azure, we realized there's a lot more you can do with it, with a cloud, with a data center infrastructure once you've built it. So, one of the things that Microsoft has really focused on is to try and build a really open cloud where we sort of invite everyone in to play a part of it. So partners, ISVs, and having a marketplace, but the cloud being a marketplace as well for big and small ISVs to run on. And this is just some of the solutions that exist in the Azure marketplace. And perhaps curious fact is that 1 in 3 VMs on Azure runs Linux today, right? And it is the part that is growing most. So by perhaps sometime next year, I will be able to say to my colleagues who work most with Windows that now we run more Linux on Azure than we run Windows. I'm looking forward to that moment. So this is a lovely slide. It displays all of the functions that exist in Azure. Serverless computing we were talking about. I mean, that's, for instance, what's the little sort of lightning bolt there, which is called Azure Functions. We have the basic infrastructure of compute and storage and networking, of course. We have compute services where our container stuff goes in. We have sort of all sorts of API management, was mentioned earlier with Amazon, in conjunction with Amazon AVS, so we have that as well. We have service buses, a lot of analytics, IoT functions. We have the higher level application platform that was mentioned earlier, with notification hubs and things like that. And we have a lot of different database. Document DB, for instance, is our NoSQL solution, similar to the previous speaker. And then a lot of stuff around it. And when I was going to do this presentation, I decided to look through these different places and look where there were either Java APIs or some sort of direct connection to Java. So this was the result. And this made me really annoyed. Why doesn't Cognitive Services, our bot framework, or Cortana, have a Java interface? Actually, looking at it a bit more closer, they are just basically REST APIs, and people have built sort of Java interfaces to these REST APIs, but we don't necessarily have. But everywhere, in every other sort of aspect of Azure, we have a Java API so that you can program it through Java if you want. Things you can do through Java code is you can, of course, get data from your storage accounts, manipulate your storage accounts, set them up, take them down, do all that sort of stuff with Java code. You can use our key vault for cryptography from Java. You can interface with our resource manager from Java to create, virtual machines and build virtual networks and stuff. Our SQL service has a Java interface, data lake, management, service bus. I could go on. Active Directory even has this nice Java interface. So all these things can be used by someone using, a Java programmer, either deploying on Azure or, deploying on-premise and using these features in Azure, as you wish. So it's a sort of full ecosystem. So we've come quite a way from, talking about, cancer and, suing people or being sued for lack of implementation of Java. If you start to look at the ways you can run Java in Azure, I mean, there's lots of different aspects you can look at. the simplest way of doing it is, or perhaps should I say the easiest or the lowest hanging fruit is probably just running virtual machines with some Linux in it and a Java application server, JBoss or something. And we have ready sort of marketplace images from Oracle, from Red Hat, even from IBM, with their sort of application servers packaged, and they maintain those images and take care of them. If you sort of step it up a little, you can use something called our scale sets, which is an auto-scaling function. So basically, you set up a bunch of VMs, and then you tell this Azure that you want those to scale according to some metric. It can be network traffic, or it can be CPU load, or there's a couple of different things you can choose, and it will automatically scale them out for you. We have our container service, which is, we all heard sort of Docker is going away and dying, but in case that doesn't happen in the near future, you might want to deploy some containers, then you can do that on our Azure Container Service. It's basically free open source orchestration systems that are packaged so that you can run them on Azure. It's DCOS Mesosphere, it's Docker Swarm, and it's Kubernetes. And it's a very, very easy way to set those up. If anyone's sort of set up Kubernetes themselves, they know it can be quite difficult. Azure does it automatically for you. We have Azure Batch for running high-performance computing solutions. We have third-party solutions like Cloud Foundry and OpenShift, which you run on the top of Azure. You take the image from the marketplace, you deploy it, and it's Pivotal or Red Hat who actually manage the images and make sure they're updated and stuff. You can run that on Azure. We have, in the process of building some of these higher level services, we also developed a framework called Service Fabric, which supports both Java and .NET. And Service Fabric is our sort of microservices framework that you can use. It's also being open sourced, and you can run it either in Azure or on your own computer at home if you want to. And then finally, we have sort of the highest level, which is our PaaS, our app service, which I'm going to demo a bit later, how you run a very, very simple bit of Java code on it. But that is sort of the real, forget about the server, forget about all that stuff. You just deploy your code, and it runs, right, leveled. And here, in a different way, right here is the control versus the cost agility, and this was talked about in the previous presentation. I mean, at the far end of it, you have the control to configure everything yourself, with your virtual machines, your own Java versions, whatever it is you want to run, how many virtual CPUs you want to run it on, what memory, what storage. You can play around with all that sort of stuff. But it does take some work, right? And up to something like, our Azure apps, OpenShift and stuff, where you actually don't do a lot of the configuration. The system already exists for you. It's more about, deploying your code on something, and then it just works. So you have all this sort of spectrum of choice. When it comes to provisioning stuff or actually interacting with Azure, I think the best way to think about it is that Azure is one gigantic REST API. That's all it is. On top of this REST API, you can build different things that interact with it. We've built some things. So we've built our portal. We've built the Azure CLI, which is cross-platform and exists in 2 versions, one written in Python and the other written in some sort of, I think it's Node.js. And you have a sort of JSON definition files that you can use that sort of define everything around, the infrastructure, the VMs, how they connect together, the storage, and all that sort of stuff. But any sort of third-party provisioning tool, if you use Chef or Puppet or Salt or Ansible or any of those, they all have Azure modules today that you can plug in and deploy through them if that's what you feel like. And if you feel like it, you can write your own CLI because the Azure API is published, and you can just go and look and meet what all the REST calls mean. Yeah, this is a bit about the Azure templates are basically a state definition of what the end state should be of your sort of deployment. So they tell you what what it should look like, and you sort of feed them into our CLI or our portal, and then they set that up for you. Some useful links. We have the Java Dev Center, which is a really easy URL to remember, Azure Microsoft.com/Java. Everything about running Java on Azure. We have code samples. So perhaps you want to use some of our, cognitive services or some of our HD, data processing stuff, big data, or perhaps even you want to integrate with Azure AD or stuff. There's lots of code snippets here that show how you do that. And we've already talked about this. There's a lot of stuff available on GitHub around, templates, code, all that sort of stuff that you might want to do. So you can just go to azure.github.com and search for Java, and you'll get, again, lots of examples of how to use it in different notification hubs, document DB, Internet of Things applications. What I'm going to demo today is the Azure integration with Eclipse. It also exists for IntelliJ, and I think a couple of other IDEs. And the idea is to make it as easy as possible to deploy directly from your development environment into Azure. The final thing I'll mention is there's something called Application Insights, which is very useful. So it's as you deploy your Java code on Azure, there's a checkbox that says, please include Application Insights, which then will give you, telemetry data from your application, how's it running, what are the requests, what's happening to it, all sorts of things. And you can even hook your own code into it if you want to, define events or errors and stuff like that. Very easy to use, ends up in a sort of a cloud service where it displays all the data you want about your application. Good. So let's see if we can do a demo. And all right, I'll just let the world catch up with my Surface. So great, lovely Eclipse workspace, nice and empty. I have installed the Azure plugin, so it manifests as an Explorer bit and an activity log at the bottom. So let's just create a dynamic web project quickly. Whoops. I don't know why my mouse is not behaving as it should. Whoops. Hang on. The mouse pad is not playing around with me. There we are. And we'll call it something like JavaForum Web. We'll run it in Apache Tomcat 9 is fine. We'll finish. We'll set it up. Then we get this nice JavaForum, and we need to add some content. So we'll very cleverly try and add some JSP file. And I know you're not probably supposed to do this, but I'll do it anyway. We'll call it index.jsp. Hide that. And we'll make it into an ordinary JSP with HTML. And so this is the sort of the level of my Java knowledge at the moment. We'll do one single command that says, hello, JavaForum. right? Complex code. I don't expect you all to understand and follow. We'll save that and save. And now comes the nice part about this. So we will now deploy this code directly to Azure App Services. And this is one of these platform as a service things where you basically just insert your code and then it runs for you. So we go to Java EE Azure Tools, and if the mouse wants to, then we publish it as a Azure Web App, and there's no container, so we have to create a new one. We'll create a DNS label for it, JavaForum GBG, and we'll create something called an app service plan, which basically just says where do I want this to live, in which region, and do I want to pay for it or not. And I think we'll choose not to pay for it. And I think we'll deploy it in Western Europe. And West Europe, if it just happens to be Amsterdam for some peculiar reason. North Europe is Ireland. Don't ask me why. And we'll call it JavaForum SP for service plan. Okay. Press the button. Wait a while. That's great. And so the only other thing I'll mention is I was talking about resource groups. So everything on Azure consists of a resource group. It's a sort of collection of, like a container. And the resource group is the level where you can where you put things into it, and then if you want to delete it, you just delete the whole resource group, right? Then everything that goes into all the resources, storage and networking, go into a resource group. You can also select what JDK you want to use. I'll just use the default one. But you have a choice of that. We'll press OK. We'll wait for a few seconds while Eclipse and the plugin do what they want to do. That looks fine. We'll press OK to deploy that, or at least I thought we were going to press OK. There we go. OK. And you'll see down there in the sort of activity log that it's deploying to the Azure, web app container that I called it JavaForum, not JavaForum. It's done. It's published. You don't believe me? Well, this is where I cross my fingers. Does it work or not? Let's see. Well, my very complex Java code is now run in Azure. And that's about the sum of it. Any questions? Is this good? Is it cool? Do you want to come and work for Microsoft? We're going to need lots of people, coming in the coming years because Microsoft is really moving from this model of, just interacting with our customers every 3 years to sort of pressure them for more Office licenses to really being a part of their business and how they work. So a lot of cloudy guys needed at Microsoft, and we really want to have the local presence as well. So if there are no more questions, then oh.
Now you have one more question about the Microsoft plan. What's the quotas or restrictions for
the free one? You can only do a certain amount of deployments, and if something else comes along and pushes you out, that's fine, right? There are no SLAs around the free plan. But for testing and stuff, it's excellent. I mean, there's nothing more free than free, right? Yeah. Yeah. Functions. Yeah. It, so it looks very similar. The way you pay for it is slightly, well, it's the same way you pay for that as you pay for Amazon. So it's all about, mostly, the only thing that costs anything on Azure is consumption, right? CPU hours. We even throw in some of the data transfer for free, unlike some of our other competitors. We only charge for things that exit Amazon or exit Azure, right? So you can put as much data as you like up there for free. But then it's about CPU hours, basically, all the consumption. Unless, if it's one of our partners' marketplace images, like if you run the REL image from Azure, then you're going to have to pay a small license fee as part of the sort of consumption thing. So that goes to Red Hat then, or our partner in that case. So yeah, but it's really easy if you want to try out Azure. You can get a free Azure Pass with 12, where you can play around with 1,200 Swedish crowns, I think is it at the moment. So it's really easy to try out. If you've got any questions afterwards, contact me. alexander.young@microsoft.com. Pretty easy to find. And you can always pop into the Microsoft office in Gothenburg as well if there's any, you want to have a discussion about cloudy stuff and Java and things like that. So apart from that, yeah. One. I seem to remember it's. I'm not the function expert, so I seem to remember it's Node, Java, and Python. Sounds very familiar to me somehow. I wonder how we came up with those languages. But yeah, I would have to check exactly. And it's easy to check as well. Azure.microsoft.com. That's the place to go for anything Azure related. Okay. Thanks lots.